My name is Christina Linden, and I'm the Director of Academic and Public Programs here at the Cantor Arts Center. And before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. On this land, Chinese migrant laborers helped construct the university and worked in the Stanford's residence. As president of the Central Pacific Railroad Company, Leland Stanford employed Chinese migrants to do the more hazardous, backbreaking work of building the Transcontinental Railroad. Between 1863 and 1869, 15 to 20,000 Chinese laborers helped execute one of the most ruthless engineering ventures in American history, a colonial project that displaced countless indigenous people and allowed the Stanfords to amass significant wealth. And I would like to welcome you to this evening's conversation, Bohemians, Realists, and Dreamers, Women Photographers in the Interwar Period. Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We'll be hearing directly from three fantastic speakers this evening. Jasmin Darznik will be reading from her most recent book, The Bohemians, in just a moment. This work of historical fiction expands upon the life of photographer Dorothea Lange, beginning with her arrival from New York in Jazz Age San Francisco. The novel imagines Lange's early career as she establishes a high society portrait studio near Union Square with significant help from her Chinese-American studio assistant, Caroline, and the circle of friends to whom Caroline introduces Dorothea. The novel sees us through to the Depression era when Lange rose to fame for iconic images like Migrant Mother, which is on view in the exhibition upstairs. Jasmin is a New York Times best-selling author of 3 books. She holds a PhD in English from Princeton University and is currently the chair of the MFA program in writing at California College of the Arts in San Francisco. Her next book, a novel set in old Hollywood, is forthcoming, and I'm personally looking forward to it. Sarah Miller has published widely on the invention, multiplicity, and contestation of documentary as a key concept in American photography. Tonight, we'll bring Jasmin's book into conversation with Sarah's 2020 book, Documentary in Dispute, which examines the 1939 photography book, Changing New York, by photographer Berenice Abbott and her partner, Elizabeth McCausland. Sarah's book analyzes the women's unique theory of documentary photography as illuminating hidden forces that shape the built environment. It also explores the contest of meaning that led to the publisher's extensive revision of their book. Sarah earned her PhD in art history from the University of Chicago and is currently a professor of art history at Mills College. Our conversation this evening will be moderated by Josie Johnson, the Cantor's Capital Group Foundation Curatorial Fellow for Photography. Josie curated the exhibition Reality Makes Them Dream, American Photography, 1929 to 1941, currently on display in our galleries upstairs. The exhibition will be on view through July 30th, so if you didn't get a chance to come early this evening to see the exhibition, I hope you'll be able to visit us again soon. Josie also edited the accompanying catalog, and she received her PhD from Brown University and specializes in the history of interwar photography. And we'll have dedicated time for questions and answers from the audience at the end of tonight's event, so we hope that you will think while we're listening to the conversation about what you want to ask, but right now, I'd love to hand the podium over to Jasmin. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you so much for everybody who is here on this evening. I'm thrilled to be here, honored. Thank you so much to the Cantor Arts Center for hosting this evening's conversation. My novel, Bohemians, takes place in San Francisco during the Jazz Age. Dorothea Lange is a young woman. In 1918, she comes over from Hoboken, New Jersey, never expects to stay in San Francisco, but the first or maybe second day after she arrives, she is pickpocketed and is left penniless in the streets of San Francisco. She winds up getting marooned in the city, and it kind of decides her destiny. She winds up living for the rest of her life in the San Francisco Bay Area and making her life's work here in California. The section I'm going to read is when she's just newly arrived in the city and she finds herself in the company of some really charming Bohemians. So it began, my life in San Francisco. When I first arrived in May of 1918, the city belonged to the Bohemians, which is to say the artists, the poets, the writers, and the vast, varied company that they attracted. You saw them everywhere, but the cafes, bakeries, restaurants, and pubs of North Beach, the small Italian village atop Telegraph Hill, were bursting with them. They'd all come from somewhere else, and they all had a story to tell. That was another thing about San Francisco. Every time you met someone, it was like stepping into a story just as they were making it up. And now I was one of them, or starting to be. To hear Caroline tell it, which she did from a back booth of copas during my first days in the city, San Francisco's best stories always started on Telegraph Hill. Close your eyes and picture it, Dory, Mark Twain sailing down Columbus, wild red hair, scraggly beard. It was plain from the heaps of books in her room that she loved to read. Twain, I now learned, was a particular favorite. Fine, I said, shutting my eyes, but where's he headed? Fior d'Italia, she said without skipping a beat. On his way to dine on oyster bisque and calamari and drink buckets of champagne with Ambrose Bierce. I cracked an eye open. Ambrose who? Ambrose Bierce. Haven't you read Devil's Dictionary? I shook my head. Remind me to lend it to you. It's wonderfully clever, a little bit wicked. Is there anything you haven't read? I just liked stories, she said with a shrug. Now stop interrupting and just listen, please. Robert Louis Stevenson, Frank Norris, Bret Harte, Oscar Wilde, Ina Coolbrith, Mary Austin, Jack London. Once the Sierras had been stripped bare and the gold rush burned itself out, San Francisco drew hordes of people to its fog-soaked streets. For every journalist, novelist, sculptor, painter, or poet who'd made a name for himself, or occasionally herself, hundreds more came looking for anonymity or immortality or some mix of the two. All day long and for many years, they hustled up and down North Beach with their manuscripts, canvases, and political leaflets under one arm and their bottles of wine and loaves of sourdough under the other. At night, they'd all return to the large squat building on Montgomery Street, where, after dining at Copa's, they'd spill into the saloon at the other end of the building for a few rounds of pisco punch. Somewhere well past the edge of midnight, they'd hole up in the honeycomb of tiny rooms on the top 3 floors. Then came the earthquake. This was the part of the story where Caroline's face fell and her voice softened. In 1906, when the earth beneath San Francisco shuddered and cracked, barely a brick budged at the artist colony on Montgomery Street. But with the rest of the city in ruins, the writers and the artists fled to other places, Carmel, New York, Paris, Mexico City. One by one, the rooms of Monkey Block emptied, and North Beach sank into a kind of sleep. Now, a decade later, a new generation of Bohemians had laid claim to the city. San Francisco was booming, even as the Great War was shattering an already broken world to bits. Up in City Hall, a plump, silk-stocking, mustachioed mayor named Sonny Rolfe was shaking hands with a brash band of investors and an even brasher band of police, observing the city's oldest tradition, making money. Not that the war was far away, it wasn't. Large convoys of young men, such young men, shipped out from San Francisco each week in starched uniforms and gleaming boots. Tanker fumes tinged the air, pools of oil swirled on the shore. The news from Europe was worse and worse. In the cafes, studios, and saloons of North Beach, there was low, urgent talk of spies, enemy sweeps, arrests, deportations. There was fear and uncertainty and dangers we couldn't even name. Still, it was a new time, a time for fresh ideas and different possibilities. Mark Twain was long gone, but Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera were on their way. In most ways, San Francisco was still a small town, and the people were fascinating, and the stories were glorious. There were men and women, women and women, men and men. The city and the decade were positively made for each other. Everyone did whatever they wanted to do. When we gathered at Monkey Block to float above San Francisco Bay, there was a sweetness to it, a sense of possibility. Kappa's might have lost its luster a long time ago, but there was still a kind of gold to the place. In my memories, I see the plush seats, the gilt-edged mirrors, the glittering chandelier. I see a place where the red velvet walls shimmered, the Victrola never stopped playing, and every hour of every day was shot through with laughter, secrets, and brilliant talk. Most of all, though, I see Caroline. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Jasmine, and thank you, Sarah. Thanks, everyone, for being here tonight. So, we're not making this in our history lecture, but we couldn't help but have a few images because photography being at the heart of all of this. As you know, I curated this exhibition upstairs on interwar photography, and I got to do a lot of fun reading, look at a lot of fun images in the process, and some of the really fun things that I got to read were these books that we're talking about this evening that I'm showing up on the screen. And I was really inspired by how Jasmine and Sarah both looked back at a project or a person that's pretty well known, especially within the history of photography, and gave a really fresh take. And that's exactly what I wanted to do with the exhibition upstairs. So that was really inspiring to me, and another reason why I'm excited to have you both here. But I also felt like your projects, different as they are, really speak to each other in a lot of neat ways. You both wrote about a woman photographer from humble beginnings, who falls in with a bohemian or avant-garde set somewhere, comes back and makes these really well-known photographic projects that come to define documentary photography, even as we know it today. And they've both do this with the help of a group of people and another woman in particular, who's really important to their stories. So I'm just gonna pull up, here's our heroes here, Dorothea Lange and Berenice Abbott. And I just wanna start off by hearing, especially we'll start with you, Sarah, just a bit more about what drew you to these projects or to these photographers. If you can share a bit more about that with us.
Sure. First, I just want to congratulate Josie on this beautiful exhibition upstairs, and and also to thank Josie and Christina for bringing us all together this evening. So I'm not going to do a reading, but I'll do a quick intro to Abbott for those who are unfamiliar, and also sort of give an overview of my book, which is kind of complicated. But first, to introduce Abbott, who was she and what drew me to her? There are so many fascinating parallels with Lange. She had an unhappy, unstable childhood. She took off as early as possible. She left Ohio for New York and landed there in 1918, the same year that Lange landed in San Francisco. She was only 19 years old, and she immediately fell in with this bohemian artist crowd. And when they started to take off for Paris in the early 20s, she did too. So she went to Paris in 1921 and spent most of the 20s in Europe. And that was where she really found her calling in photography. She became Man Ray's studio assistant in Paris and learned the craft of photography from him. And then opened her own portrait studio in Paris, which really became like the destination for the whole sort of expat literary and artistic community. It was the place to have your modern portrait made in Paris. Although Man Ray might beg to differ. they became a little competitive. And then do you want to Do you want to go to the next slide with Water and Dock Street? Yeah, great. But then Abbott really did her best-known work when she came back to New York starting in 1929, arriving right with the stock market crash. And specifically, that work is called Changing New York. She started it as an independent project as soon as she arrived back in New York, but it got that official title when she won sponsorship from the Federal Art Project, which was a New Deal agency, in 1935. So it was federally sponsored from 35 to 39, but she was adamant that it was an entirely self-directed project that she started before she got sponsorship. And that's where she met McCausland. In fact, Abbott got her first show at the Museum of the City of New York in 1934. And McCausland, who was an art critic for the Springfield Republican, which is quite a notable Massachusetts paper, reviewed it, and Abbott said, "This is the first intelligent review of my work that's been written in this country." And so they met and embarked on a 30-year romance. And the romance was also a professional and intellectual partnership in every way, especially in the 30s and 40s. Because it was McCausland who really helped Abbott hone and articulate a theory of her own photography, a theory of documentary, and a theory of photography's place in modern art. Not many people realize actually that almost everything published under Abbott's name after 1935 really emerged from McCausland's typewriter. They were very simpatico in their thinking, but it was McCausland who really helped put words to what Abbott was doing.
I did not know that until yesterday when it blew my mind.
It was sort of a gradual realization for me. And then, do you want me to talk about how my project got started?
I would love that.
Great.
Let's,
Okay.
yeah, please go right ahead. And here's a bit of some of the images from Changing New York as well.
Yeah.
What drew you to Berenice, Abbott, and McCausland?
So my project got kicked off a very long time ago now when I found out that, let me back up. In 1939, sort of at the end of her Federal Art Project sponsorship, Abbott received an offer to publish part of Changing New York as a book. And Elizabeth McCausland, art critic, was commissioned to write the text. So it was really should have been their dream collaboration. And my project got started when I discovered that McCausland had written an entire manuscript for the book that had gotten rejected and had never seen the light of day. But it survived in the archives at the Museum of the City of New York, which is the institutional home for the whole larger Changing New York project. And so I was very curious, why would this manuscript get rejected? And it wasn't just McCausland's text that got rejected, it was the ordering of the photographs, a significant proportion of the images that the two women wanted to put in the book got cut. And so I developed this deep desire to reconstruct the book as it should have been seen, because I realized that McCausland's manuscript was a couple of things. It really cut against a lot of standard narratives about documentary photography in the 30s. And it was this fascinating manifesto about Abbott's practice of interpreting the city through photography, but also a kind of didactic text that was meant to help readers adopt Abbott's practice and critical way of interpreting the built environment. So I realized that the rejection, the battle over publication had really been a battle over the definition of documentary photography, A, and B, photography's uses to tourism and the kind of interpretation of the cityscape on the eve of the 1939 World's Fair in New York, which was also very had a real kind of urban, futuristic urban planning theme.
The world of tomorrow, right? Yeah, which I copied and named one of the sections in my exhibition upstairs after that event. Thank you, Sarah. I mean, just to point out for everyone, I mean, Sarah's really helped rewrite our understanding of documentary photography, thanks to bringing this manuscript to light. And this is something I've really followed in her footsteps in this exhibition upstairs, and was really interested in exactly this idea that you could have a photograph that, clearly shows what was in front of the lens, but that there can be so many more ideas behind it, that it can really go somewhere else and have some really complex, advanced, ideas behind it as well, as in Abbott and McCausland's case. So Jasmin, what inspired you to write the Bohemians? And I've got perhaps an image related to what you were saying earlier as well.
I have to look over your shoulder because I can't see it behind me. But I think we see Montgomery Block behind me. So for me, this whole adventure began with this building. This building once stood at the crossroads of three worlds. It was at the edge of the financial district, Chinatown, and North Beach. So these three worlds, downtown San Francisco. This is where the Transamerica Pyramid now stands. Even though I had grown up in the Bay Area, I had never heard of this place before. But in its time, particularly its last 40 years of its life, it was home to some tremendous number of artists. People, including Mark Twain, had lived in this building. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo lived there or had visited in 1930 when they came. And I just fell so hard for this building. And it turns out you can't write a novel just about a building. You have to put people in them, and you have to make them move and say things. And so I started scouting almost, I knew I wanted to write about a woman. I knew roughly I wanted to write about the 1920s and 30s in San Francisco. And I settled on Lange. I came to Lange through Maynard Dixon, who had his studio. So Lange's first husband, Maynard Dixon, was an extraordinary painter of the American West, and he had his studios very close to here. And so really, it was through Dixon that then I traced back to Lange. And, it really showed to me one thing was a very different side of Lange. And I think this is where we can maybe cue the next images. So I think most everybody's seen a photograph of Lange, and her work, really, the work that we know, the body of work we know best is the work she did during the Depression. And if we think of her at all, it's this solitary figure sitting on top of the car. And looking at her life in San Francisco in the 20s made me realize that she wasn't always a solitary, renegade, and she wasn't always an icon, of course. She was a woman who was very much, pulled herself up by her bootstraps, so to speak. And critically, she had a number of other women photographers in San Francisco who helped guide her, showed her the way, and became really critical to her self-conception, her idea of what she was and also what she could do with her photography. So from the building to Lange is roughly the journey.
I'm going to pull up one more great image that pulls together some of this history that I skipped over, but this is at Lange's studio, right? It's around 1920, and a bunch of the photographers featured upstairs are also in this image. We've got Imogen Cunningham, I think on the left-hand side with her hands out. At the top center is Anne Brigman. On the right, second from the right, is Edward Weston. And then, I'm not sure which one, Dorothea Lange is below.
Yeah, I think she's the one kissing Anne Brigman's feet, or she's prostrating herself. So nobody's
like
seen
hair.
Lange like this before, have you? I mean, but
Yeah.
this was her, this was her gang, so to speak, and they'd gather at her studio at 540 Sutter Street. And, they got into all kinds of, trouble and shenanigans. Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So you clearly had plenty of amazing, factual information to go off of here. I mean, just, and histories have been written surely about, these figures and their work together. But you went in a different direction. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? And I'll pull up one of these great, archival documents that are the kind of thing you looked at, but then, took somewhere else.
Yeah, so there were a number of extraordinary women around Lange, and really all of them, each one of them is deserving of a novel. But the one person who really captivated me was Lange's Chinese-American assistant. It just seemed to me so interesting that Lange had chosen a Chinese-American woman. For one thing, San Francisco, just to kind of peel back the years here, is a segregated city at this time. The Chinese have to live in, it's the borders of current-day Chinatown, but they cannot live anywhere else in the city. We're coming up on the most stringent anti-Asian, anti-immigrant legislation this country had seen. And so it was so curious to me, how had they met? How had they even met, these two women from such radically different worlds? And it also really provoked me that so often the woman was not named. She was just called the Chinese mission girl or just the Chinese girl. And no one that at least that I saw, really thought this woman had been an important part of Lange's life, or that she was deserving of a story. And that's the kind of provocation that I think is fuel for a novelist. So I went into those spaces where possibly, potentially, no historian could go. Sorry, Sarah. And for me, as a novelist, I think if you're going to attempt to tell a historical story, I think you should attempt to tell a story that history can't tell. It couldn't tell, it won't tell, and looking particularly at the story of women of color, of Asian American women, there are huge gaps and fissures, and that's exactly where I went. That's where I wanted to kind of stake my territory.
Amazing, yeah, thank you. And well, let's see where Sarah did go in the archives, because you had some interesting experiences as well, and I'll pull up some images from the book if you can kind of just walk us through, some of your experience with the archives and then how this, came together in your book.
First of all, no apologies needed. I mean, I envy the license of a novelist. So you might think that our experiences in the archives were really different because I reproduced so much stuff verbatim, and Jasmin really sort of filled in all of these big gaps with the imagination. But in some ways, there are some interesting sort of similarities. So Abbott's archive was dispersed, or Abbott's papers and were dispersed among several different archives. But the most important one was controlled privately by the same person who controlled her estate. And I actually wasn't allowed to use materials from it for years, many, many years, partly because he was a really sexist, homophobic person who didn't want Abbott to be written about in terms of her relationship, didn't want people to put McCausland back into the story, was afraid that the market value of her work would fall if everybody knew she was queer, which everybody already did. So it was a very strange situation. I actually waited years and years for that material to be sold to an academic institution so that I could do the project that I wanted to do. So that's, and sort of in the meantime, I was sort of cobbling together like bootleg copies from other sympathetic scholars so that I knew that archive was going to enable me to tell the story. So there's that, and then I'll also point to some of the sort of creative things that we did in design to overcome gaps in the archives. So my book is divided into 3 parts, and the first one really does reconstruct the entire lost manuscript with McCausland's text in the order of the photographs that she specified. And so that's what you see here. so it's 100 photographs and 100 texts, and in each case I reproduced McCausland's original text, but I also reproduced the text that was in the published book. So in that sense, it's a reference, so people can go back and forth and compare what was published to what was desired.
As we can see on the screen, right, so the bolded parts kind of at the top are the original manuscript, and then
Yes.
beneath that you placed, so you could really compare the two side by side, yeah.
Right. And then we also had to make some creative decisions in this reconstruction. I worked with amazing designers on the book. Because the women didn't leave a design mock-up for this version of the manuscript. There's actually not one original manuscript. There's kind of like many iterations of plans for the book. And so there was an early design that didn't match up with this manuscript. So we sort of took the spirit of the earlier design mock-up and used it to kind of guide things like bleeding the images to the edge and placing them off-center on the page. If you flip back to the published version, you'll see it's quite staid. And McCausland was really super annoyed about that because one of her many talents was book design. And she and Abbott were big proponents of avant-garde book design, so they were really annoyed that the publisher gave them this very old-fashioned format. And so this is just a sample spread from the reconstruction. And then the next, if you want to go to the next slide, this is just one example. The middle section reproduces a bunch of archival documents, a prospectus, a sample text, a bunch of documents that really make clear the kind of agenda that Abbott and McCausland had laid out for the book. And I also reproduced some letters that show how bitter the battle over the revision was. There was an argument over practically every photograph and every text. And then in the last section, it becomes an academic work of art history, right? I sort of trace the development of Abbott's documentary theory, and I analyzed the original manuscript for this very unusual theory of documentary that was not part of our standard history, especially of government-sponsored projects in the 30s. And I talk about the World's Fair as a kind of the upcoming World's Fair as this context for a battle over the uses of photography to interpreting the cityscape and thinking about change, the forces of change, the dynamics of so-called progress.
And you've got an example of this here, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I like to show this. This would have been the very first image in the book as Abbott and McCausland designed it, and you can see the two different versions of the caption. I was really struck by the way that McCausland sort of. She has the ambitions of training the reader to read Abbott's photographs as both deliberate compositions, artistic compositions, and as critical statements about the forces of change in the built environment. And here, just from the very beginning, she lays out what would become the kind of thread of the commentary, which is this idea of dynamic equilibrium. And she teaches the reader to see that Abbott's photographs, that the documentary is a practice of composition. It's not just a recording of facts. It's a meaningful composition of the built environment or the found world. And so she's really teaching people to read this, starting here with this by introducing these themes of visibility and invisibility, and her insistence that this invisible tension is the real subject of the photograph, and that the city itself is composed of invisible forces that the photographer can make manifest, can make visible, can make into a kind of commentary. And at the same time, Abbott is sort of announcing here that she's not going to reproduce the cliches, the visual cliches of touristic photo books, right? She's photographing the Brooklyn Bridge from underneath, and what she's really doing is compressing 4 different time periods of architectural style and technology into a single image, so that one is forced to understand the present as a kind of simultaneous layering of multiple historical moments and forces. So it would have been a great opening gambit.
These are really like advanced, complicated ideas though for the time. I mean, so it's really fascinating, and Sarah does a great job of laying this back out, I think. Let's take a step back though. We're going to
Okay.
hear from Jasmin one more time, another passage from a bit earlier than this moment when, feel free to go. I'll keep sending you up. When Abbott and McCausland are working through these ideas, but back at, circa 1920, Dorothea Lange is kind of formulating her ideas about documentary photography, which are also so important to how we understand the medium today. And she's, also got this circle around her of some other familiar names that we haven't heard from yet tonight, but that pop up. So go ahead, Jasmin.
Okay, so this is where I say, meanwhile, in San Francisco. So Abbott is in New York, and Dorothea Lange is in the Bay Area, and I think you're going to recognize some of these characters. We're at the Camera Club, and in the city, at about 19 or 20 now. I wandered around the gallery. The room was full, and I weaved in and out of the crowd, sometimes staring over someone's shoulder or stopping where a cluster of people had gathered to admire a particular picture. I recognized a lot of the places I'd seen in San Francisco, the all-white Victorian-style Conservatory of Flowers in Golden Gate Park, the gold-domed Palace of Fine Arts, the last vestige of the 1915 Panama Pacific Exposition, the Ferry Building with its Italianate clock tower, sharp images, the gleam of metal and machines. That's what got you noticed nowadays. They were fine, I supposed. A few of them were even quite accomplished. Trouble was, most of them revealed nothing beyond what they showed. Nothing of the person who'd taken them, and in the case of portraits, not much about the people in them. Then, for a second time, I saw Imogen Cunningham's work. It was a group of 5 portraits, likely part of the same series her husband had picked up from the Five and Dime shop where Lange was working. I walked from one to the next, admiring the fleshy indent around a child's wrist, the nipples just above its hand. Each image reflected the photographer's tender, steady gaze. "Imogen, dear," a voice called out. So she was here. I swiveled around. A woman is speaking with Imogen Cunningham. She leaves, and Dorothea sort of comes in close. When the woman had drifted off, I stepped forward and introduced myself as a friend of Consuelo Kanaga. "Oh, dear Connie, is she here?" said Imogen with a smile. When I'd explained that she'd been called away to cover a strike, Imogen said, "Well, of course she was. But I'm very pleased to meet you, Dorothea, and this is my friend Ansel Adams." He was a young man, 16 or 17 years old, I guessed, a tousle of brown hair atop his head. His nose was crooked. I'd found out later that the 1906 earthquake had sent him crashing against a wall face first, breaking his nose and setting it permanently to the left. This is a true story, by the way. It gave his face a mischievous look. Ansel thinks he's a pianist, but I'm helping him discover his true calling. Photography? Exactly. But this, here Imogen gestured around the room, isn't helping him take it very seriously. She dropped her voice, but only slightly. He thinks it's all, how did you put it, Ansel? Murderously dull. Yes, that was it. She turned back to me. And what do you think, Dorothea? There are some accomplished pictures, but you don't sound impressed. Well, it seems to me that there are other uses to a camera than just its showing off its technical powers. That got the young man's attention. Such as? Well, what a photographer can do, what you do, Miss Cunningham. Imogen, please. What you do, Imogen, which is to let people really see one another. Only one another, Ansel said. I tilted my head toward him. How do you mean? What he means is, could you use your camera to make people really see crickets and ponds and mountains? And that's Ansel's notion of the world. Well, I make portraits, but it seems just as vital to show people what's around them. Everything's worth looking at, if only you see it clearly enough. Imogen smiled again. I'm sure we'd both love to see your photographs. You did bring some, didn't you? For a few minutes after we reached my portraits, Imogen and Ansel stood looking at them without saying a word. There was a restlessness to Ansel, a barely contained energy, and it was focused now on my pictures. While Imogen narrowed her eyes and tilted her head this way and that, he stepped closer, then walked a few steps back to look at them from a distance. The first was of my boss, Mr. Marsh. It was a picture I'd taken late in the day, just before we closed up. It had a blurriness I liked. It always took some time before people showed you who they really were. Some people never showed you at all, but I'd learned to be patient, to wait, to make conversation, to let time dissolve the mask that people put up for the world. Mr. Marsh had a harshness to him, a hardness to him, always, and it was only when I'd got him to tell me about his son, who'd fought in the war, that the mask began to fall. How extraordinary to see a face day after day, then one day find it strange and surprising. Mr. Marsh was that sort. His face gave nothing away, but it had some secret in it. And this one, Imogen said, nodding at a second picture, is it yours too? Yes. The second portrait was of Caroline sitting in the window of her apartment at Monkey Block. She hated to sit still, and I'd just about given up trying to get a good shot when I came up with the idea to shoot her while she worked on a dress. In the picture, she was looking down, but with the way I'd cropped it, you couldn't tell at what. The light from the window was strong. That kind of light usually washes people out, but not Caroline. It made her clear, fine features finer, her dark lashes darker, her hair blacker, glossier. It wasn't perfect. I wasn't happy with the finish, but it was a picture that made you wonder about the woman in it. Who was she really? What sorts of thoughts swelled through her mind? They're beautiful, Ansel announced, clapping his hands and smiling broadly at me. I flinched. Beautiful? He gave me a puzzled look. Have I offended you, Miss Lange? There's no quicker way to dismiss a woman's work than to call it beautiful. His confusion seemed to deepen. But what's wrong with beauty? Why is a picture only considered good or important if it's ugly? He shook his head. Surely you'd agree it's as necessary for an artist to show people the evidence of life's beauty as it is to give them a document of its ugliness and despair. Well, for one thing, I don't consider myself an artist. You should. You must. I agree, Ansel, Imogen said, and then she turned to me. It was so much fun putting those people in a room together. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love hearing about them in a room together. That's a lot of fun. And they were. And, you know, Ansel and Dorothea go on to be great friends for years and years, you know,
And
afterward.
they're having a version of that argument for the next 40 years of their lives.
Right.
This is the argument that they never stop having.
Yeah, but remain friends throughout,
Yeah.
which I think is really wonderful too. Yeah, one of the great friendships in,
Yeah.
in photo history. So, you know, as we can see in that great passage, you know, there are a lot of ideas there that they continue working out, like you said. But, you know, she's working at the time. We've got a couple examples here of, you know, early in the 20s, later in the 20s. This is a print that I really cherish that we have here at the Cantor that, you know, while you're describing, wondering what thoughts are going through this woman's head. You know, I've spent a lot of time wondering that myself. But she's a portrait photographer, and it looks fairly different than some of the things we know most from, you know, Dorothea Lange's work, including the migrant mother photograph we have upstairs. And then the same is true for Abbott, and I've got some of her early portrait images as well. So, Sarah, how do we get from, the portrait studio to all of these things that you've been describing? Abbott's not continuing to photograph people. Not only does she do it in a different way, but the people aren't even there anymore so much. So can you walk us through that, please?
Well, one of the interesting parallels has to do with, the ways that photography opened up opportunities for women and very specific opportunities at specific times. So interestingly, Abbott, establishes a portrait studio in Paris in the 1920s because at the time, just like for Lange, it was really the only route to being a kind of independent professional woman photographer. A studio portrait was pretty much the only thing you could have, even for a sort of avowed avant-garde like Abbott already was in the 1920s. And then, I think for both of them, the emerging language of documentary and eventually federal sponsorship make it possible to be a woman photographer of a new kind, of a really unprecedented kind by the earlier mid-30s. So, so how do we get from here to documentary? One of the most useful things about Abbott's portrait studio is that it really connected her to an international avant-garde. And so she was not only meeting peers in the art world, but sort of acquiring important patrons like Peggy Guggenheim. But also in Paris, the really important thing that happened is that she became acquainted with Eugene Atget's photography, alongside many other avant-gardes and surrealists. And she was profoundly influenced by not only Atget's photographs of Paris, but also the kind of avant-garde writing that was spawned by Atget's work right after he died. So we're talking about really sort of avant-garde writing in little magazines in 1927, 28, 29. And Abbott has scrapbooks full of articles that she collected that sort of develop the early language of the document on the basis of Atget's mysterious architectural work. And that's where you get this really European avant-garde notion of the document that Abbott and Walker Evans are instrumental in bringing back to the United States. That's the notion of the document, not as a kind of dry fact, but rather as this kind of subversive non-art image that reveals the fantastic or the barbaric underneath the kind of skin of civilization. So that notion becomes super, super important for Abbott as she comes back to New York in the 1929 and starts taking her own New York photographs. I should also say, for those of you who don't know it, Abbott actually literally rescued Atget's archive. She, with the help of the gallerist Julian Levy, purchased in 1927, when Atget died, most of his negatives and prints, and eventually brought them back to the States. And most of that collection is now at the Museum of Modern Art. So she was really the protector of his legacy for decades. So anyway, she returns to New York and she vows to do for New York what Atget did for Paris, which is to say that she turns from portraiture to making document photographs. And when I say she wanted to treat New York like Atget, like she thought, or like the avant-gardes thought that Atget treated Paris, I mean that she vowed immediately that she would not replicate standard views of monuments or the picturesque, but rather that she would kind of treat the cityscape as a visual text to be interpreted for social values during a period of rapid destruction and modernization. So these are some of the early photographs that are, they're quite small. They mostly exist in scrapbooks. A few of them were published in little magazines. She even sent some of them back to Europe to be published in little magazines circa 1930-31. There's a show right now at the Met of her early New York album, actually, which is nice to see the excavation of Abbott's work continues. And actually, if you could put up the next slide.
Yeah, how about this image that hopefully some people recognize from the exhibition upstairs?
I was thrilled that the collection has this photograph and it is on view. This is like a great example of the ways in which Abbott was inspired by Atget's work, or really, honestly, like more of the surrealist writing about Atget. She really develops, she takes that inspiration and works it into this notion that documentary can be a kind of subversive archaeology project. that it's a way of surfacing the irrational and archaic forces from underneath the surfaces of the modern city. And not only is this photograph of this bizarre antique store a great example, but it also spawned McCausland's most surrealist caption, right? She's really working the language of surrealism hard here. Not with 100% success, but it's entertaining, and the ambition of it is important. She really delights in how what she sees as the kind of found montage of the city itself can kind of be frozen and sustained in a kind of shock, right? That the photograph can sort of perpetuate the shock of coming across these bizarre moments.
And Sarah, they're not surrealists, as in, aligning with Breton, right? But they're interested. Complicated relationship? How
You
would
mean
sum that up?
Abbott and McCausland?
Abbott and McCausland, yeah.
It is really complicated. I don't want to get too far into it, but I'll just say Abbott was very much immersed in surrealism in Paris without seeing herself as a practitioner of it. And what was really important to her were surrealist writers, less, more so than artists. Because it was surrealist writers who really developed an important kind of theory of the new photography or modern photography based on this kind of posthumous reading of Atget. So it's a somewhat tangential relationship. She also tended to disclaim the label surrealist once she was back in the States, because in the States it acquired a kind of connotation of decadence that was not useful to her in the States for a lot of reasons, having to do with sponsorship and reputation and sort of changing attitudes in the art world. So,
Thank you. It's a complicated one that I've been trying to tease out for 30s photography in general. I'm going to just jump ahead a little bit. Jasmin, thinking about all of these ideas of documentary photography again, I want to go back to Lange here and some of the ideas that you described. So how does she sort of get from that, portrait studio moment to what we, know best from her work?
Well, Lange is in San Francisco in 1930, 31. She's watching the city deteriorate. She's watching great hardship every day. She can't not see the deterioration of the quality of life in San Francisco. And the way she tells it is that I think it's a good story. I think she had been thinking about this for a while, but the way she tells the story is that she was finishing up some photographs and she looks out her studio window and she sees a man who's lost in the streets of San Francisco. And she realizes that there is an enormous gap between her and the city and its people. And it feels absolutely untenable that she cannot stand that distance anymore. And the way she tells the story is that's the moment she decides that she has to shutter the studio, that she has to go into the streets and begin to photograph the people. It was probably, the way I imagine it is that she'd probably been thinking for a long time about it, but that moment of, that moment, I think, when it was distilled for her was in this one figure lost in the streets, yeah. And she, she doesn't think of herself as an artist. It's just this call she feels to be part of the life of her city that pulls her out and away from the studio.
All right, I've got one more question for the both of you, and then we'll open it up. But thinking about your, different approaches to these somewhat similar projects, I'm wondering, for you, Jasmin, is there, a project sort of like Changing New York within Dorothea Lange's work that you feel like, deserves some reconsideration, basically, and going back to? And then, for Sarah, I'm wondering if there's a character or somebody, similar to Caroline, that you've wanted to kind of rescue from obscurity, basically, in the archives in the way that, Jasmin's done in her novel.
Should I go first? Well, I would love to see the work of these women photographers put into conversation, into one collection. I have not seen that before. I think it requires that we surrender some of our fantasies about genius working in solitude away, from the company of others. I think it requires us to think about genius in a different way, right? So I would love that. Some of the people might be known to you, but others like Consuelo Kanaga, who was such a renegade, and she was doing work that would take at least another 10 or 15 years before Lange attempted the work that Consuelo Kanaga was doing in terms of documentary photography, but also her ambition to show race and America that was not widely visible, right? So she was doing groundbreaking work, and it would just be, I think, a beautiful project if anyone is to undertake it, to put these women in conversation and show their work together as part of one story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll gladly work on that.
Yeah.
And I want to point out Consuelo Kanaga, too. I've been asked before, who was left out of this exhibition that I wish could have been in it. And I think there's a lot of things that I left out that I wish I could have put in. But I think Kanaga's really high on the list. And I'd even formally requested a loan of one of her gorgeous prints. But it was already spoken for an exhibition that's being put on by the Brooklyn Museum, which has her archive. So that is coming. She's going to be a even better, known figure soon, and it's going to be really incredible because her work is really amazing and not as well known as it should be. So, Sarah.
I have to say it's a pretty easy answer, McCausland. I think McCausland is the totally undersung sidekick. She was a really well-known, nationally known art critic in her time. She and Abbott were a New York power couple. And McCausland is a fascinating character who had fingers in all kinds of things, not just photography, but she curated an exhibition for 2 exhibitions for the World's Fair. She helped run the Photo League. She published all kinds of art criticism. So she's a fascinating character. Luckily, I don't have to be the one to write it because I actually know that 2 people are already writing fictional,
Novels,
sort of historical fiction about McCausland and/or Abbott and McCausland's relationship. So stay tuned.
Yay, amazing.
Yeah.
Great. All right. I'd love to open up to questions in the audience. I'm going to hand off this microphone.
Sorry, it's not a very weighty question, but with regards to Abbott, the photograph of Union Square with the statue on the ground, could you unpack that a little bit?
Sure. So I think that photograph is 1931, 32. Yeah, it's on the slide with 3 images from early 30s. Abbott was really drawn to monuments throughout Changing New York, both the pre-Federal Art Project and the post, because they were symbols of kind of conventional authority in the built landscape. And also symbols of the kind of lazy, famous person version of history that she was interested in overturning. And so, I mean, a casual viewer might assume that Lincoln had been deposed. Actually, Lincoln was just lying on his back for cleaning. But the message of the image doesn't change, right? And so I think that sort of deposition of authority within the Belt landscape was something that she sort of learned from Atget, but really honed in a very into more of a political critique that really had to do with sort of one of the themes that runs through the project is this interest in the way that power and authority are inscribed in the urban landscape. Actually, can you also go to the slide that has the John Watts statue and the gun? And she's interested in the ways that these sort of invisible forces that shape the urban landscape are often kind of violent. Right, and violent not in ways that are always obvious to us, more like the violence of capitalism. Or in this case, a much more obvious but also witty image of a gunsmith's sign aiming directly at the police station. And that's an image she had to go to great lengths to sort of make the angle line up. So, yeah.
I may have missed this in the introduction, so forgive me for that. First of all, Jasmine, I loved your book. Can't wait for the next one.
Thank you.
Sarah, what started this quest for you? How long did it take? And was it funded? Was there a project?
I'm embarrassed to tell you how long it took, although I did provide the caveat that I couldn't publish certain things out of one of the archives for a long time. This was actually started in graduate school when I discovered the unpublished manuscript and has been published in several iterations, essays, an essay in a museum catalog primarily, before I got funding to reconstruct the entire book. So 20 years in total, if you really want to know. I was very, very lucky to, the Ryerson Image Center, which is now called the Image Center at Toronto Metropolitan in Toronto, acquired the archive. I already had a relationship with them, and so they asked if I wanted to be a research fellow there to sort of plumb this archive that I'd been waiting to see for years because the owner wouldn't let me access it. And from there, I was able to propose the book project to them because they have an academic book series that's generously funded. And I could not have done it without a ton of institutional support. It involved the Museum of the City of New York, the Ryerson Image Center, the MIT Museum. It was just a tremendous amount of kind of like intellectual property, in addition to how expensive it is to publish photographs well, and to publish this many of them. So yeah, I was really grateful that they were able to subsidize the project and bring in fantastic designers as well.
I'm curious to know why you wouldn't consider portraiture as documentation. Every portrait gives so much information. And I was surprised that you separated, she did portraiture before she did documentation.
Well, I'll also ask Jasmin to speak to that, but I'll just say that as somebody who's studied the actual history of the term of documentary, it wasn't really in circulation yet. Abbott would not have used that term herself in the 20s. And I don't know, I'll let you answer whether you've found instances of Lange using it, but for mostly in the American context, the language of documentary did not get rolling until 1929, 1930. So Abbott would not have, wouldn't have used that term for her portrait practice.
I
don't think Lange used it either for many years, and probably, I just imagine she even resisted it once it was in circulation. But something that you made me think about was that Lange's always a portrait photographer. It doesn't matter if she's in the studio or out on the highways and byways, she's always taking portraits. It's that the subjects changed, that they became much more, well, for one thing, she allowed for happenstance. So moving out of the studio, she let herself fall in with the city and was able then to have accidents happen. These moments of just chance encounter would then, I think that was such an exciting move for her, though she was still, of course, taking photographs, but she couldn't control it in the same way. She was part of the story in a way, but she was also surrendering to chance.
For Jasmin, I'm also interested in how long it took you to write The Bohemians and how your process for writing historical fiction from historical documents.
Yeah, it's not tidy at all. I really work in an almost associative way, so I'll plunder. I have a marvelous time just plundering endnotes. That's where I find the best materials are in those the hidden sources. Don't you agree? The best stuff is. And then, I'll go off. I spent a lot of time thinking about the city of San Francisco and the built spaces, the built environment of San Francisco, and the way that informed women's lives at the time. So it might be 2 months I'm just studying architecture, and none of that shows up. I say, I think if a modest but true numbers, I probably use about maybe 5% of what I find. I think I jettison 95%, but it's great fun, and I think it informs the work ultimately. So I let myself wander. I let myself be curious. I use my curiosity as a compass. It's quite undisciplined and messy. But then at some point, the characters begin to emerge, and then they just kind of shunt everything to the side, and they want their stories to be told. And that's when speaking of surrendering to chance, then I leave off the research for a while, and I just focus on the plot and allow the characters to tell me where the story needs to go. And then I'll go back. Usually, I was talking to Sarah about my copy editors and how cruel they are and merciless. But there's a lot of very fine detail work that happens at the late stages of the novel where I'm looking at such particular details. Sarah was saying, when you come across an error in historical fiction, it just breaks the spell of the story, doesn't it? So you really want to the best of your ability, preempt a reader from, being pulled out of your story. But the research is the best part, honestly, if I could get away with with just researching. But I also find it really stokes my imagination. So I knew, for example, that I didn't want an upper-class lady in San Francisco as one of the main characters because their lives were so sequestered. It was women who were in the working classes who were traversing the city. I wanted that kind of woman, and that was the kind of woman then that Caroline becomes. I wanted someone who could move through the city. But if I didn't know that about the historical realities of women's lives then, it wouldn't have got me spinning the story in this way.
Hi, Jasmin.
Hi.
I'd like to ask a question. Just so, as Toni Morrison likes to say, right, characters are like ghosts, and all they want is to tell their story. They don't care about everybody else's story. And I feel like this is so appropriate to like this context where documentation and photographs are kind of like those stills of life that while they have passed, right, they're still somehow living on. And so I wonder what of her photography or Miss Lange's photography kind of imparted to you, like her voice or the pieces of her personality that could only have been in that artistic context?
Really haunted by her photographs during the Japanese internment. So if you're asking for my project, so her photographs of the internment, they haunted me. I think they haunted her. They're haunting images. You all should look them up. They were impounded and unavailable for view for, I think, 50 years or so. But I think there was this way in which I was writing into those images, in a sense, and I was thinking about, I think our empathy and our love grows over time. And I don't think that suddenly in 1941 or when the executive order came down, that it just emerged then. I think living in that San Francisco of that time, and seeing this cruelty toward Asian Americans at that time, I think it implanted something in her that you don't see it emerge until maybe other moments, in her photography. But that's something that I think about, is that those writing the book was it was almost like writing my way back into the mind that fastened on those beautiful portraits she did of children during that era. And so it's imagining a connection, but letting the ghosts guide me. I love that, Toni Morrison.
I'm not sure I can actually how to phrase this, but it fits in a little with this question. So historical fiction is history, it's fiction.
Yeah.
How, when you were trying to somehow exude the personalities of these characters, did you let your imagination go where you wanted it, or were you able to actually find out about, for example, the caustic way in which Imogen would deliver her message to other photographers of us around who actually experienced her.
Oh my goodness, wow.
The way in which she was in the world. And so I'm kind of curious to know whether you were able to get a handle on Ansel's personality, Imogen's personality, not just what they said to each other, but who they were as personalities.
You'll have to read the novel to see if I don't know. I don't know if I did it well. I certainly hope I did, because you really are trying to distill the essence of a person by, of course, you're looking at everything available, any interview you can find. Some of the really useful, let's say for Lange, she did a series of oral histories with UC Berkeley in the 60s, and getting the cadence of her voice, her spoken voice as it was, helped me not just modulate her voice in the novel, but the way she spoke told a story about her. She was a plain-spoken woman. She did not. That's why I couldn't make her. I wrote a book about a poet, and the poet sounds very poetic when she speaks. But Lange would not let me. She would not have allowed that. And I think you also do have, when it's someone so well known, you have a responsibility. You can't entirely just make it. Has to feel extracted from the historical, whatever's available. It has to feel consonant with what you knew of the person. So something of, I hope, Imogen's brashness comes out, right? But I am careful to tether it, or at least everything in there, even if it's imagined, has to feel like it could have been that way, or she might have reacted this way. But I don't know if I did it. You're going to read the novel and tell me.
Great. I think that's our last question. That's all we have time for, but thank you both so much for joining us.